All right, thanks for watching once again. I had a request, and I don't know if the person who made the comment wants to be named or not, so I'll just leave it anonymous. It says, I'd like to see a biblical explanation of sacrifice, beginning with God killing animals in Genesis to cover the iniquity of the first people. Muslims do not understand the sacrifice. It's the missing link in their thinking of Christianity. So I won't go all the way back to Genesis, but the concept of sacrifice is a very interesting topic in the Old Testament. And so I'll talk about sacrifices, particularly in the context of the Levitical system in this video. And I'll mainly address the burnt offering in Leviticus 1 to make some important points about that, and I'll allude to the sin offering and the concept of atonement in Leviticus as well. So this is going to be a super casual conversational style video. To formalize this and cite all of the scholarly resources and so forth would take hours, and people would be bored to death. So I'm going to try to keep this discussion of Leviticus engaging and hopefully interesting. If you want to read about Leviticus, some really good scholars to consult would be people like Jonathan Clowens. John Walton has some really good background in the IVP commentary. People like Baruch Levine, Jacob Milgram. These are major names. Dr. Michael Heiser has some really good work on this as well, where he combines a lot of information from these sources. So these are some names in the world of ancient Near Eastern scholarship that you might want to consult if you want to study Leviticus. So I just completed, or I won't say I completed, but an initial study. I completed an initial study of Leviticus. There's much more into it, but I did this several months ago. And Leviticus is fascinating to me, one, because I'm interested in the ancient Near Eastern context, the ancient Near Eastern frame of mind and way of life and so forth. And when you get into these systems of sacrifice, it's a window into the ancient world. It's a really good way to ask questions of the text, like, why did they do this? Or what were they thinking when they did this? And when you get this window into their day-to-day activities, in the context of sacrifices, it really gives you, again, a window into their world and a unique perspective into the way that they thought. And so for me, it's a fascinating topic, and the concept of the ancient Near East, obviously, inherently linked to the Old Testament, and it's a continuing topic of interest for me. And so that's why Leviticus is interesting, but it's also interesting because the theology in Leviticus is as applicable today as it was in Leviticus. And from that theology emerges application. But when I talk about Leviticus, the first thing I want people to understand about Leviticus is what it is not. And if you have heard any popular level exegesis of Leviticus, I doubt that there has been a sermon that anyone has heard on Leviticus recently, but if you have heard popular level stuff, popular level commentaries on Leviticus, the content I provide in this video is going to most likely run against that, because the concepts that you get from a simple English reading of Leviticus are very different from what the Hebrew text actually says. And you have to be careful in Leviticus taking the simple English translation and running with it, because you get yourself into a lot of exegetical trouble. So I want to talk about what Leviticus is not first in two important areas, and then talk about what it is and how it applies. And towards the end of the video, I'll talk about a significant objection that Muslims offer, and they've done it a couple times on my channel as well, and how Levitical theology is a very strong refutation of that objection. So those are two good reasons to study Leviticus. The theology is just as applicable today for Christians, and it's a window into the world of the ancient Near East. So when you read Leviticus and you read the scholarly information on the background of Leviticus, scholars try to figure out what these people are thinking the sacrifices did for them. So when somebody brings a burnt offering to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting, what was going through this person's mind? What was the sacrifice doing for them? And so scholars come up with things like communion theory, consecration theory, gift theory, where you have various concepts. They're bringing a gift for God. They're bringing an offering for God because they want to commune with God. They want to pray or whatever. And so when you're reading through Leviticus, think about these three sort of different contexts. Communion, consecration, gift theory. What's going on for each particular offering? And often you'll find that it's a little bit of all three. Maybe one isn't sufficient to explain, but perhaps it's a combination of these three concepts. So the burnt offering in Leviticus, I'll talk about this and use it as a segue to open up some conversation on other things in Leviticus. So the burnt offering, I won't read the whole chapter, but it just starts off in Leviticus 1. When anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering, he says in verse 4, you are to lay the hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on behalf to make atonement for you. Okay, so a couple of things to get from this chapter. First, it doesn't say why you are to bring the burnt offering. Okay, it could be for a number of reasons. Again, think about gift theory, communion theory, consecration theory. Maybe an ancient Israelite wants to spend some time with God, and to approach God's presence, you only do so on the terms that he has set forth. So in this particular case, it's a burnt offering. And often a burnt offering would come before an additional offering or a sacrifice. And so the burnt offering was sort of the lead-in, it was sort of the icebreaker to the rest of the sacrificial process. But regardless, the burnt offering, Leviticus 1 talks about in verse 4, it will be accepted on behalf to make atonement for you. And so we get into immediate exegetical trouble here if we're not careful. Because we think about the atonement, we read the simple English translation, atonement, and we think about New Testament atonement theory. And that is not where you want to go with this. And there are numerous reasons, and I'll cover a couple and I'm going to be rather detailed about this because it needs to be clearly demonstrated how we're to think about atonement and how we're to think about the sin offering and so forth. So this is Baruch Levine's commentary on Leviticus, and he cites the same word that's used, which is kaper, is the Hebrew KPR root, pronounced kaper, and the same word for atonement in Leviticus 1:4 is used in Exodus 30:12, and it's a very serious concept. It talks about an Israelite was required to contribute a half shekel as a head tax to the sanctuary. Again, Exodus 30:12, it's the same word that's used. Each shall pay the Lord a ransom for himself. Okay, and Levine says, proximity to God was inherently dangerous for both the worshiper and the priest, even if there had been no particular offense to anger him, that is, to anger God. The favorable acceptance signaled God's willingness to be approached and serve as a kind of ransom or redemption from divine wrath, a totally different concept from the sin atonement that we think of in New Testament theology. And he is right on track here. I mean, this is what the mainstream scholarship is saying about the concept of atonement. In the IVP background commentary, the entry on atonement here for Deuteronomy 1:4 says, many scholars now agree that atonement is not the best translation for the concept on either the ritual or theological level. And that's an important distinction, because I'll demonstrate ritually and theologically that atonement is not to be understood in the New Testament sense, because it is a different Hebrew, it's a different concept in Hebrew. It says, perhaps the most convincing is the fact that in the ritual text, the object of atonement is neither the sin nor the person, but a holy object connected with God's presence, such as the ark or the altar. To put it in common terms, and he links this later to for this and other reasons, recent scholars have preferred purification as the translation. And so to put this in common terms, the blood in Leviticus is never applied to the sinner. Not one time is it applied to the sinner. Now, I'm saying that very carefully because it is applied to the person. For example, in the context of skin diseases, it's applied to the earlobe and to the thumb, but that's not a sinner, right? It's a skin disease. It's an issue of ritual impurity as opposed to moral impurity. Okay, so the blood is never applied to the sinner. Do a word search for blood in Leviticus. It shows up 65 times. And the blood is applied to the sides of the altar. I'm just scrolling down through the results. Drained on the side of the altar, the horns of the altar. Leviticus 4, which is where the sin offering is talked about. It's sprinkled before the veil of the sanctuary. So the point is, you can again do a word search, go through the entirety of Leviticus. The blood is never applied to the sinner. It is applied to inanimate objects. Okay? Within the sanctuary complex. So if you want to think about sin, about atonement as atonement for sin, again, taking the simple English translation, then you run into some significant theological problems, and that is the blood is never applied to the sinner. So in what sense is it an atonement for sin? Rather, it's applied to objects that cannot sin and therefore do not need atonement. It's applied to inanimate objects. Now, the same concept is true with respect to the sin offering. Because when we see sin offering, we think sin. Again, take the simple English translation and import that into our modern understanding, and we're in deep trouble exegetically and theologically. So there are textual reasons and contextual reasons for understanding the sin offering as a decontamination offering. Okay, the text critical reasons. If you know a little bit of Hebrew, katat is the noun from the verb katah. All right, that's sin or sin offering. It's the same word that is translated both as sin and sin offering. However, the noun katat has a doubled middle consonant in the Hebrew, which means it's from the PL stem of the verb katah, which means to decontaminate. That's the best conceptual understanding of it. So a sin offering, when properly understood exegetically, is a decontamination offering. That's the concept. It's not a moral offense. Rather, it's an issue of ritual impurity. Okay, so that's the text critical reason to think of sin offering as a decontamination offering. But there's a contextual reason as well. You just look at the context. Sin offering in Leviticus 12 is applied to various natural processes like childbirth. Same in Leviticus 13. In Luke 2, this is the offering that Mary is bringing, right? A purification offering. So unless you want to think that there's something sinful about childbirth, you have to understand contextually that there are reasons to think of sin here as a purification offering. Okay, there is no moral violation that's in view. Again, these are natural processes like childbirth. Sin offering in Leviticus 4, notice the blood is applied only as far into the sanctuary complex as the sinner can go. So if a normal person sins, a lay person from within Israel, the blood is applied to as far as they can go within the sanctuary. If a priest sins, the blood is applied farther into the sanctuary because the priest can go farther into the complex. But again, the blood is applied to objects within the sanctuary. So you have to understand a sin offering as a purification offering. Okay, it does not refer to a moral infraction. Okay, and again, Leviticus 12 is a really good example of that. Leviticus 4, it does refer to inadvertent sins. But again, the blood is not applied to the person. It's applied to objects. And so that needs to be understood to understand the sin offering. It cannot just be universally taken as an offering for a moral offense. And even when it is, when you think of the concept of atonement, you have to understand where the blood is applied. It's applied to objects within the sanctuary. So now you can just back the question up and say, okay, well, if childbirth isn't sinful, why is an offering required for childbirth at all? And that goes into the ancient Near Eastern worldview, and it has to do with I'll just say the loss of a life function. Okay, when you understand the way that they thought about this stuff, it makes perfect sense. To go into that would probably be a little bit more in depth for this video than perhaps we should venture. So I'll just stop there. But the purpose of the offering is is related to their worldview and makes sense when you understand their ancient Near Eastern frame of mind. So, okay, let's talk about why these exist then. If we can't understand sin, if we can't understand a sin offering in terms of a moral violation, such as, again, Leviticus 12, if we can't understand atonement in the New Testament sense, then what is going on in Leviticus, right? And to understand what's going on, think of the concept of sacred space, okay? And as I go through this discussion, Genesis, the cosmic Garden of Eden, is going to come to your mind. Exodus 3 is going to come to your mind, where God tells Moses to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. The concept of sacred space is that God's presence is holy, sacred, sanctified, set apart, perfect, incompatible with any sort of impurity. And that's why Baruch Levine in his commentary cites Exodus 30:12. If you're going to approach the presence of God as an imperfect person, you do it carefully, because it's a very serious thing. You don't just stroll into the tent of meeting complex one day on a whim and decide you're going to spend some time with God. Okay, quite frankly, it can be a very scary place to be. Leviticus 10 is a good example of this. And when you approach God's presence, when you approach the tent of meeting complex, you do so carefully and you do so in accordance with the methods that He's provided. Imagine you're an ancient Israelite and you look out your tent in the morning or the afternoon and you're constantly seeing this sacrificial process. And you're seeing blood of these animals applied not to the sinner, but to objects within the sanctuary, within the tent of meeting complex. And you're thinking about these concepts of purging and purification. What is the message that you're getting? The message that you're getting is God's space is sacred. And you have to take the appropriate precautions to approach Him. God wants to be there. He wants people in His presence. If you haven't watched my video on a story of the Bible or something like that, I call it, it's basically, it traces the theme of God dwelling with His people all through the biblical text, from Genesis to Revelation. That's the plan from the beginning, and that's the plan that God will providentially bring to order. God will dwell with His people, and God wants to dwell with His people. The tent of meeting complex is right there, and He's given the ancient Israelites a means to approach Him, but they are not pure. They're not perfect. They're not holy, and God's presence is all of that. And to approach God, you need to be very careful. And God's presence, these objects in the tent of meeting complex, need to constantly be purified, decontaminated because of the sin of the people. And so in the ancient Near Eastern worldview, God's presence is holy. It's sacred space, and people are sinful, and they need to approach God on His terms. And that was the purpose of the burnt offering. It was an icebreaker. You know, okay, God, I know I don't belong here. I don't meet your standards. But you've said I can approach you. I can spend some time with you. I can pray. I can ask something. I can bring an additional offering. But I'm coming into your presence using the methods that you have given me because I want to spend some time with you. And I know your space is sacred, and I'm respecting that. And that's the ancient Israelite worldview in part. And what's going on here in Leviticus. Now, I said that there's some theology that we can take from this concept. And again, I'm providing a very broad overview of the sacrificial system. But once we get rid of the misconceptions of sin and atonement as it's conveyed in the simplistic English translation, then the theology of Leviticus emerges for us, for Christians. And this intersects with an objection that Muslims offer as well. The theology for Christians is that God dwelling with His people, of course, is inaugurated in a new and powerful way with Jesus, right? Jesus is God dwelling among His people. Jesus says in John 14, I will send the Spirit. He will be in you. God dwelling with his people. Paul picks up this theme, 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians 6. Do you not know that your body is a temple of God? Okay, now let's import this stuff from Leviticus. Let's import this Levitical theology, the tent of meeting complex, the purification, the purity, the holiness, the sanctification that God requires of his presence. And let's import that into this concept in the New Testament of God dwelling with his people. Paul says your body is a temple of God. Okay, let's think about it in Levitical terms. Your body is a tent of meeting complex. What was the tent of meeting associated with in Leviticus? Holiness, purification, sanctification, perfection, completeness. It was utterly absent of any contaminating factor. It was absent of anything unholy. God's presence was sacred. God's space is sacred. And in the New Testament, the temple of God is the body of believing Christians. And so Christians are to live a sacred, holy life. Christians' lives are to parallel the tent of meeting in Leviticus. Be holy, be sacred, be set apart. And so when Muslims ask about the New Testament concept of the atonement and say, well, Jesus has paid for your sins, can't you just sin all you want? That's to take Levitical theology and turn it on its head. It's to look at this concept of the sacred space that God occupies and say, well, can't you just bring any sort of decontamination or any sort of contamination into your life that you want? Can't you just use the concept of the atonement in the New Testament to write yourself a blank check for sin? No. The Christian is to parallel his life alongside this Levitical theology. The purity of the tent of meeting complex, the purity of the sanctuary, is what the believer is to parallel in his life, because our bodies are a temple of God. Okay, so if you want to think as a Muslim, well, you can sin all you want, no, it is a theologically incoherent objection, and it's utterly defeated in Levitical theology. Now, if you're a Christian watching this and you're thinking, wow, all the blood and all of the gory stuff in Leviticus and how the sacrifices had to be repeated continually, the sacrifices cost something. You had to bring something of your own possession. You're listening to all this and you're thinking, wow, what Jesus did is so much better, right? That's the exact concept in Hebrews. And the idea there is, if you could accept the old covenant, the law that was given by God, how can you not accept the new covenant? It's so much greater, the new covenant that Jesus inaugurated. And thinking about Levitical theology puts a new significance to Jesus' statements when he says something better than the temple is here, something better than the sacrificial system. Jesus said, catch this, I will destroy this temple and in 3 days raise it up. He's talking about his body. The temple has become a body, just like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3 and 6. The temple of God is now the body of believing Christians, God dwelling with his people. I could go on and on about the theological ramifications of Leviticus, but these are just some practical applications that emerge from Leviticus when you understand Leviticus in its own terms in the context of the ancient Near East. So I hope this video has been perhaps interesting. If you can do an interesting video on Leviticus, like I said, this fascinates me, but I understand it's not a topic of interest for many people. But I hope this explanation has been helpful, and the theology, the theological application has been helpful to Christians, and then, of course, the explanation of the sacrificial system helpful to Muslims who might have some misconceptions of it. So I hope you enjoyed this video on Leviticus, and if there's some interest from it, I could do more. We'll just see from the comments section how this goes. So thanks for watching.